3 carrier strike groups. Roughly 5,000 Marines either already arriving or now moving toward the region. Thousands more troops from the 82nd Airborne entering the Middle East. Amphibious assault ships crossing the Pacific. F-35Bs on deck. And after days of mounting pressure, the Strait of Hormuz is still at the center of the crisis. On March 27th, USS Tripoli entered the Central Command Area of Responsibility, with around 3,500 sailors and Marines. Days earlier, USS Boxer and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit had already departed for the region. Add that together, and the message is clear. This is no longer just about airstrikes, destroyers, or warnings. This is layered force moving into place. Carrier aviation for sustained pressure, amphibious ships for rapid response, Marines for contingency operations, airborne troops for speed. And on March 31st, the 3rd aircraft carrier entered the story. USS George H.W. Bush departed Norfolk with more than 6,000 sailors and 3 destroyers, heading toward the Middle East and adding even more weight to a crisis that is still centered on Hormuz, because that is what changes the tone. 1 carrier shows presence, 2 carriers show endurance, but a 3rd carrier moving toward the Middle East sends a different message entirely. The buildup is still expanding, the pressure is still growing, and Washington is still adding force to the region. So the question is no longer whether the United States can send more power into the Middle East. It already has. The real question is why another carrier is still being sent, what mission this expanding buildup is actually preparing for, and whether the fight over Hormuz is about to enter a much more dangerous stage. This is what makes the current moment different. The United States is not reinforcing the region with just one category of force. It is stacking multiple layers at the same time. Carrier groups for air power, amphibious ships for flexibility, Marines for contingency, airborne troops for speed. The structure of the buildup matters as much as the size of it, because this kind of posture gives commanders more than one option if the crisis gets worse. USS Tripoli matters because it brings much more than a deck and a hull. It carries a Marine air-ground task force that can react fast, shift mission sets quickly, and operate in the space between naval pressure and a larger regional contingency. USS Boxer reinforces that same message from behind. This is not a one-ship signal. It is a force package. And then comes the 3rd carrier. That is why USS George H.W. Bush matters so much. The ship itself is powerful, but the deeper message is even bigger. Washington does not believe the current force posture is enough yet. If the situation were stabilizing, you would expect the reinforcement cycle to slow down. Instead, another carrier is now on the move. A lot of people hear 3rd aircraft carrier and immediately jump to one conclusion: invasion. That is too simple. A carrier strike group does more than prepare strikes. It can widen air operations, defend ships, reinforce deterrence, protect regional assets, and sustain pressure over time. So, when a 3rd carrier enters the wider crisis picture, it does not automatically tell you what Washington has decided to do. But it does tell you Washington wants more endurance, more leverage, and more room to escalate if needed. That is the real meaning of March 31st. USS George H.W. Bush leaving Norfolk was not just another deployment headline. It was a signal that the crisis around Hormuz is serious enough for the United States to keep adding naval weight, even after Marines and airborne forces were already moving. That is what makes the 3rd carrier the key detail in this story. And it changes how every other deployment is read. The Marines no longer look like a standalone reinforcement. The airborne troops no longer look like a temporary surge. Once a 3rd carrier starts heading into the wider theater, every piece of the buildup starts to look like part of a larger design. Why Hormuz is driving all of this? At the center of everything is the same narrow waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. Washington has now tied its pressure campaign to one condition. On April 1st, Trump said Iran wanted a ceasefire, a claim Iran rejected, and said the United States wanted to see Hormuz open first. That means this is no longer just about punishment. It is about forcing a strategic choke point back open. And that is a much harder mission than simply launching strikes. Reopening a threatened waterway takes sustained presence, escorts, air cover, rapid response, and the ability to deal with shifting threats at sea. That is why the force mix matters so much. A carrier alone is not the whole answer. Marines alone are not the whole answer. Airborne troops alone are not the whole answer. But together, they start to look like the kind of posture built for a crisis that could deepen before it resolves. That is also why the third carrier keeps coming back to the center of the story. If Hormuz were just a political talking point, another carrier would not matter as much. But if Hormuz is the operational problem Washington is trying to solve, then every new ship and every new unit becomes part of that equation. What the Marines in 82nd really add? The Marines change the tone of the buildup because they represent flexibility. They are not there just to sit offshore and look impressive. They are the kind of force that expands the number of things commanders can actually do. Rapid reinforcement, protection missions, limited contingencies, fast response to a changing situation. That is why USS Tripoli and USS Boxer matter beyond the headlines. The 82nd Airborne adds something different: speed. The deployment of thousands of paratroopers, including a recent surge of about 1,500, tells you Washington also wants fast-reacting ground capability in theater. Again, that does not confirm a large-scale ground offensive, but it absolutely confirms that planners want more options available close to the crisis. And when you combine Marines, airborne troops, amphibious ships, and a third carrier, the message becomes unmistakable. This is not one signal. It is multiple signals stacked together. Each one expands what the US can do next. Each one raises the pressure on Iran. And each one increases the sense that the current phase of the crisis may not be the final one. So what happens next? That depends on whether pressure works. If Hormuz reopens in a way Washington can call credible, then this buildup may be remembered as a coercive posture that forced a strategic result without crossing into a much wider war. But if Hormuz remains contested, then the logic behind sending Marines, airborne troops, amphibious ships, and a third carrier only gets stronger. And that is what makes this moment dangerous. The more forces move into the region, the more options Washington gains. But the more options Washington gains, the more likely it becomes that the crisis is judged not by rhetoric, but by what those forces are actually expected to do. The third carrier is a perfect example of that shift. It is no longer just about signaling resolve. It is about preparing for the possibility that resolve alone may not be enough. So here is the bottom line. The story is not just that more American troops are entering the Middle East. It is not just that Marines are arriving. It is not just that Hormuz is still unresolved. The real story is that on March 31st, USS George H.W. Bush departed Norfolk and turned this into a third carrier story. That is the clearest sign yet that Washington is still adding weight, still widening its options, and still preparing for the possibility that this crisis will not end quickly. When the third aircraft carrier starts moving, the message is no longer only political. It is operational. And until Hormuz is open, every ship, every Marine unit, and every airborne deployment will be judged by the same question. Is this still pressure from a distance, or preparation for something bigger?